All right, well, we are going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. If you don't know me, my name is Greg Sindelar. I'm the CEO here at Texas Public Policy Foundation, and we have a real treat today because we have one of my personal heroes, Senator Phil Gramm, here today, and his co-author, John Early, to talk about their new book. But before I do that, I wanted to recognize a couple of special guests in the room. One, we have our wonderful board member, Stacy Hawk, who's right here. So thank you for being here, Stacy. Our wonderful former board chair, Wendy Graham, is here. And of course, the amazing, that's right. Yeah, Wendy hired me. Yeah, if you don't like what I'm doing today, it's Wendy's fault, right? And of course, the amazing Kent Hance is here. I offered Kent to come take my spot, but he turned me down. But maybe we'll do that again because we've done that before, and Kent and Phil together is quite the show. Well, when I first heard that Senator Gramm was writing a book, I said, man, we need to do an event. I didn't even know what the book was about. But then Senator Gramm and I talked and he told me what it was about. And I thought, how providential. You know, TPPF has recently started a project called the Alliance for Opportunity, where we are working with two other states, Louisiana and Georgia, Senator's home state, to work on poverty issues. And we're looking at how do you effectively measure poverty? And how do you get people off of these programs and taking control back from their lives? And so when I got the book, a copy of the book, and read it, I was like, man, I need to get you guys as senior fellows in this project. This is amazing. So we have a lot to cover today. And so I don't want to spend much time on introduction. So we're going to get right to it. So first, I'm going to do some quick intros and then turn over to the senator. But obviously, I don't even know what to say about Senator Gramm that hasn't been said or written. But in the book, you talk a lot about seeking truth, and in a world where truth seems subjective, I appreciate that you have always been someone who seeks actual truth and speaks to that truth. But Senator Gramm obviously serving 18 years in the Senate representing Texas and 6 years prior to that in the U.S. House. He was author of the Reagan budget. I worked alongside our good friend Kent Hance, and prior to that, maybe most importantly, he taught economics at my alma mater, Texas A&M University. I told him I wore my Aggie tie for him just today. Currently, he is in private equity and is a senior fellow for the American Enterprise Institute. So please help me welcome Senator Phil Gramm. And then his co-author is John Early. John is a mathematical economist and is a adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. I didn't know the best way to introduce you, John, so I was going to talk about what Phil said about you in his book. And he said about your work, he goes, I quickly concluded that we would never live long enough to understand the American system of collecting and reporting statistics at anything like the level of understanding present in John's work. I can't think of anything more complimentary than that for Senator Gramm to say that. And we're just honored to have you here. So please help me welcome John Early. So Senator, I know you and John both have a very quick presentation, so I will turn it over to you.
Okay, I don't know.
There you go.
Okay. Well, also, John was the assistant commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics twice. First of all, thank you so much for coming. I signed Hance's book. I don't have a better friend in the world than Ken Hance. This book is about America and about America's extraordinary achievement in creating a cornucopia of goods and services, and in fact, distributing those goods and services broadly across the population of our great country. About 25 years ago, economists started doing research on what people owned and what they consumed. And they increasingly found that the income statistics of the country did not explain how people could consume at the level they were consuming, especially low-income people. And in the last 10 or 15 years, we have had an extraordinary anomaly in the American statistical system. And that is that the census calculates a number called household income. And it is the basic building block of everything you know about your well-being relative to other people in the country and the country's relative well-being. The poverty rate is calculated from household income, inequality, which you hear about every day and especially during an election year. And these facts are important because they're the way we judge our well-being, and how we feel about the present, how we read the past has a profound impact on the future. So we started looking intensely at this measure of income. And the first thing we found was that the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out data every year saying how much Americans consumed by quintile. That is the bottom 20% up through the top 20%. The Census Bureau puts out household income. Well, this year, the census figure shows that people earn only about half as much as they spend in the bottom quintile. In the second quintile, they spend 11% more than they earn. And in the top quintile, people spend only about 50% of their income, even though there's no data to show that people are saving at that kind of rate. In 1965, we were providing $9,700 worth of transfer payments to the average household in the bottom 20% of American earners. Since 1965, it has grown to $45,400. That's government transfers to the average household in the 20% lowest earners in America. And during that period, the poverty rate has remained virtually unchanged, oscillating between 14 and 11%, depending on the state of the economy. How is all this possible? Well, what we found in going back to 1947 is that the Census Bureau in 1947 decided to count only cash equivalent payments. And in 1947, it wasn't a bad approximation. But with the war on poverty and with the growth of fringe benefits, as John will show you in the tables that he'll present, huge amounts of resources have been transferred by government, especially to lower income Americans, in what are called in-kind transfers. For example, food stamps, you get a debit card. Medicaid, the government pays your medical bill. Housing subsidies, the government pays your rent. And also we found the census does not take taxes into account, so that when you get a refundable tax credit, which the IRS is now the largest welfare agency in America, none of that counts as income to the people who get it. When you pay taxes, the Census Bureau does not take that into account in calculating your income to compare it to other Americans to see what income distribution is. So our official statistics of the United States, as hard as this is to believe, don't take into account 40% of gross domestic product. They don't take into account any taxes. They don't take into account 2/3 of all transfer payments. They take into account only 0.9 trillion of $2.8 trillion of transfers. Now, the Census Bureau tells us that the top 20% of Americans earn 16.7 times as much as the bottom 20% of Americans. We show in this book that when you count all transfer payments as income to the people who got the payment, and you subtract all taxes from the income of the people who paid the taxes, that the ratio is not 16.7 to 1, it's 4 to 1. Now, you can argue that we should be transferring more resources, that we still have too much inequality. But the point is, the argument is very different when the ratio is 16.7 to 1 versus 4 to 1. We also find that when you count all transfer payments and taxes, that transfer payments have grown so rapidly in the last 50 years as compared to the after-tax income of middle-income working Americans, that the bottom 60% of Americans almost make the same income. We found when you count all transfer payments that the poverty rate right before the pandemic was not 12%, but between 2 and 3%. And you've all seen, the economists said it is a fact universally accepted that income inequality in the West is high and rising. Bernie Sanders says it's obscene and it's unsustainable. We show that when you count all transfer payments as income to people that got the benefit, and you take all taxes away from the people that paid the taxes, that actually income inequality is lower today than it was in 1947. Now, this is a pretty profound point, so I want to make it one more time. We are debating in America radical changes in our economic and political system to deal with income inequality when it is in fact falling. Now, that's awfully hard to believe, and that's why I want you to read the book. Okay. Now, we deal with a lot of other issues, but let me just talk about two big ones. Do the rich pay their fair share? Well, you couldn't pay the share Bernie Sanders wants them to pay, but here's the point. The tax rate rises as income rises up to 0.01%. It reaches a maximum, this is federal, state, and local taxes, of about 40.6%. And then it levels off, and for a very small number of mega income people, it dips slightly because they get almost all their income from capital gains, which is taxed at a lower rate, and they give so much money away. We show that based on international OECD data, that the top 10% of earners in America pay a larger share of the total income tax burden than the top 10% pay in any other country on the face of the earth. That the bottom 90% pay a lower share of the income tax burden, including Social Security taxes, than the bottom 90% in any other country on the face of the earth. We also look, you'll remember that when John Kennedy was president, the tax rate was 91%. And people say, well, we had relative prosperity at 91%. Why couldn't we do it again? Well, President Kennedy argued that people were wasting resources because nobody was paying taxes at 91%. They were just burning up resources, avoiding taxes. Well, we go back and prove that that is the case, that the actual rate paid by the top 1%, the top 10%, is higher today than it was when the tax rate was 91%. At 91%, depending on the year, as few as 4 households filed tax returns that paid taxes at that rate. Now, that didn't mean they weren't affected by it. It just means they did a whole hell of a lot of things to try to avoid it. We also look at who the rich are. Who are these people? Well, we don't live in a zero-sum world like Plato. We live in a world where people create their own wealth. A new college graduate, Elon Musk, he created the wealth he has. He didn't take the wealth away from us. How are we worse off because Bill Gates is better off? We're better off because he's better off. And also, it doesn't hurt to note that he only owns 7% of Microsoft. The other 93% is mostly owned by pension funds, and that's our money. When Warren Buffett makes all this money and doesn't spend any of it, well, who does it help? It helps us. He invested in America, creating jobs, growth, and opportunity. And what we argue in the book is when Warren Buffett dies, and it'll be a sad day in my opinion, when he dies and the government gets 40% of his money and spends it, we'll be worse off than we are today with him investing it in the future of America. America never promised equality of outcome in the competition for life. The liberals, the socialists, it's not fair to call these people liberals anymore. It's unkind to liberals. But the socialists argue that the proof of the unfairness of America is you got these rich people. But what America promised, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, is a fair chance and an open way to use your industry, enterprise, and intellect. America never guaranteed that we all had the same amount of those things or that we would use them equally effectively. America has always viewed the world the way Will Durant did when he, the great historian, when he wrote, "Liberty and equality are sworn and eternal enemies, and when one lives, the other dies." And America has always chosen liberty rather than equality. But we look very, very closely at income mobility. Do people have a chance to rise in America? They not only have a chance, but the great majority of them take it. 93% of people who grow up in poor households in America end up living in families that have higher income than their parents. 2/3 of them end up having much higher income than their parents and rise as compared to the population as a whole, including 6.1% of them that go all the way to the top quintile. And it would be more if it weren't for the fact that the explosion of welfare benefits has caused the labor force participation rate, or a better way to say the number that work, in the bottom 20% of earners to drop from 68% to 36% in 50 years. If you drop out of the labor market, the American dream doesn't work for you. It's also important to note that there is real mobility in the bottom three, in the middle three quintiles, and in the top quintile, with every advantage, where your parents are normally highly educated, they've got money, they can recognize your problems, they can try to deal with it, they can send you to private schools, they can get tutors, they can get counselors. 2/3 of people born in the top quintile fall out of the top quintile as adults. America works. America is competitive. And we conclude, we have three policy recommendations. One, we need to get our facts straight. We need to force the census to count all income and to take taxes into account. We need to know what's happening in our country. Now, critics of the book say, well, obviously these people are against welfare. Well, never once do we make that argument. We just simply say we ought to know how much money is being spent. But the point is, we need to get our facts straight, and then we can have this debate. Secondly, the largest source of earned income inequality is, do you work or not? The biggest reason that Americans earn different levels of income is that some Americans work and some don't. And so we make an argument that if you're going to give the average poor family $45,400 a year, basically putting them in the middle class, you're going to have a work requirement. And we had great success with the Clinton work requirement if we applied, and that applied only to AFDC. And I'm probably running over my time and I'll get quicker. Okay, but if we applied that, we could bring millions of people into the labor market and bring the American dream to them. And finally, education, the second largest source of income, earned income inequality, is the quantity and quality of education. And the big failure is in primary and secondary education in middle schools. And it's a subject I feel very strongly about. I failed the 3rd, 7th, and 9th grades. My father died and my mother got $8,000 of GI insurance because he'd served in the war. She sent me to private school. The first week, they discovered I read at the 3rd grade, 9th month level. And it changed my life. How many people are like me in the South Oak Cliff school system? I'd bet a hell of a lot of them. And they're being cheated. Now, look, we make the argument for school choice. And we make it, there may be a better way, but it is the only one that is statistically proven to work. And we make, if you want to see all the facts related to the failure of public education and the blowing away the argument that they don't get sufficient money, we show that's a false argument. And a full-throated argument for school choice, read the last chapter of this book. Anyway, now John Early is going to go through some of the numbers.
I want to add my thanks to Phil for you all inviting us here, and we look forward to a robust discussion after our brief presentations. Now, we seem to have technical difficulties again. It's on. Okay. It's not working.
Okay, point, it's going to get another one.
Oh.
Well, it worked 20 minutes ago.
Yeah. Okay. I'm good at hand puppets.
Yeah, we can do it. We can do it by hand.
Okay. Yeah. So just go ahead and click. Yep. I'll just point when I want one. There we go. Okay. So this is the distribution of household income that Senator Gramm mentioned. This is the official United States government data put together by the Census Bureau. And it tells us that in the bottom quintile or bottom fifth of the population, the average income is about $13,000. And in the top quintile, it's about $220,000. Now, the problem then is that an accurate representation? Now, these data can be shown in a number of different ways, and we'll actually look at a couple of them. But this is the basic data, and we're going to talk about how it's spelled. So that's where the 16.7 times comes from. The top quintile has 16.7 times as much income as the bottom quintile does. Now that distribution is composed of two components. One is earned income from work and from savings. The other is transfer payments that government gives people. And so those two pieces are added together to get the 16.7 times difference between top and bottom. So we're going to look at those and see what else we need to do to get a better understanding of what the actual income condition is. So this is starting with earned income that's been improved in a few ways that we discuss in detail in the book. But we then to say, now, what is the effect of adding transfer payments? Census adds that amount of transfer payments, which is only about 1/3 of the $2.9 trillion that in 2017 were spent on transfer payments. Composed heavily of Social Security, unemployment insurance, temporary assistance for needy families. But they miss 2/3 of that $2.9 trillion. So there's $1.9 trillion that's not counted for, and such things as refundable tax credits, Medicaid, food stamps, big programs.
Over 100 programs.
Over 100 federal programs, and then that's not even counting the state and local programs. And you'll see there that the bottom jumps all the way up to, almost $50,000. So that's a very different income distribution than we had before we added all the missing transfer payments. Now that missing transfer payments then looks like this. As you can see, it sort of flattens and jumps up. And that's where we get a 5.7 times difference. If we add in all the missing transfer payments, the top makes 5.7 times the bottom, which is a lot different than what census told us. And we haven't even considered the fact that they don't take care of taxes, because if the government giveth, the government can taketh away. And so this is what the distribution looks like. And then we add the orange and red shading here to show what government takes away about 7% of the bottom and 35% of the top quintile. Within that top quintile, of course, it gets up over 40% at the higher end of that. And what we have left then is income after transfers and taxes, which is shown by that dashed line there. And if we've now compute that number, we see 4.0 difference. In other words, we have reduced the inequality from 16.7 to 4.0 by this particular metric. But what's also interesting is look down there at the bottom of the distribution. See that bottom 60% that Senator talked about? Almost no difference between the bottom quintile and the middle quintile. So we want to diagnose that one a little bit and say, what's going on there? And this is the same data in a slightly different format, because we're going to do some comparisons here. If you look at that carefully, the second quintile has only 8% more income than the first quintile or the bottom quintile does. Not much difference. And yet 2.8 times more of work age adults have a job in the second quintile. And on average, they work 1.8 hours, 4.8 times as many hours per week when they work. They put in all that extra effort, and yet they get a mere 8% more income. Difference made up by, of course, transfer payments. Compared to the middle quintile. And we see here the difference is somewhat bigger, but only 32% for working more than 3 times as many people working, and for them working more than twice as many hours. So that tells us that there's a difference. But what it doesn't tell us is, what about the size of the household? Because this is the basic data is just for the household and period. But bottom earners, the bottom quintile on average has a household that's about half the size of the household of the top quintile. And if we make standard adjustments for household size, and we average 3 different ways of doing it, we will of course see that the top to bottom drops still further to 2.7 to 1. But what's really interesting is just how flat the first, second, and third quintiles are. The bottom 60% of the population is basically getting income that supports the same level of benefit, the same standard of living for all 60% of them, even though they have those at the top and the middle are working 3 times more frequently, and they work twice as many hours. And look at that, the bottom quintile actually has 5% more income than the second quintile. So where's the incentive to go to work? No wonder we have, more than 60% of the adults in the bottom quintile not working. And even the middle quintile is only 7% more than the bottom. So that is where we get this disincentive to work. That is why we get to the point of saying, well, we need a work requirement here. So there's a terrible disincentive to work. And this is a matter of also of injustice, speaking of justice and equity. Okay. Now we're going to use a slightly different measure called a Gini coefficient. This isn't some critter in a bottle. This is a fellow's name, and he designed it to measure inequality. So a zero inequality means perfect equality. If every household got exactly the same income, it would be zero. On the other hand, if one household has everything, it would be 1. And so this is what the census showed. If you take their data and run it back to 1947, and that gives us a almost 23% increase in the inequality as measured by Gini's coefficient here. However, we of course know that's not exactly right, because they don't account for 2/3 of the transfer payments, and they don't account for taxes. If we do that, we find out that in fact the Gini coefficient declined by 3% over that period of time. So this is a matter of what is our fact base. We've been told that income inequality is high and rising. In fact, it's not very high, and it's not rising. So that may tell us something different about what we want to do as a policy matter. Okay, now Senator Gramm introduced the issue of the measurement of unemployment. The blue line here is what poverty, what poverty looked like prior to Johnson announcing the war on poverty. And over that preceding 20-year period, poverty had fallen by half, and it was a pretty straight trend line going on there. Now, what happened after that? So he announced a war on poverty. We appropriated trillions of dollars, and lo and behold, it doesn't look like a whole lot happened. And we have simply this oscillation between about 11.1% and a little over 15%, just up and down with the business cycle. So we were doing great until we decided to declare war, and it went away. That's not quite what happened. Because what happened? All those transfer payments weren't counted. So no wonder nothing happened. If we count all those transfer payments, we found out that it drops down to about 2.5% by 2017, which was the end of our study period. And then another topic that we won't go into in a lot of detail is that there are additional improvements that need to be made in what are called the thresholds. In other words, what defines poverty level for particular sizes and compositions of family. And if you make those changes, it's just a shade over 1%. So as we have defined poverty originally as a level of living, has basically been eliminated, except for those core few people who need special attention, but pumping more dollars in isn't going to make the problem go away for them, those who are physically and mentally unable to deal with daily life. Okay, so let's talk about those real rich folks. Do they pay their fair share? Well, there's lots of anecdotal evidence around that people love to do. There's also the case of the purloined tax returns that we read about last year, which were wrong, but that's another story. But this is a couple fellows, Sayes and Zuckman. They're colleagues of the famous fellow Piketty, those of you who may have heard of him. And they did the tax study for that group. And this is what they claim are the tax rates by, in this case, they're doing it. Okay, back up. That's all right. In this case, they're doing it by percentiles. And so, and their ranges of 10 percentiles. So we call those deciles, if you would. But basically, they say that even the poorest households pay about 25% of their income in taxes, and that it rises very slightly to about 28%. And then it falls off to only 23% because all those really rich folks just are dodging their taxes. And they call this unjust. In fact, that's the injustices in their in the title of their textbook. But let's now compare that with the data we know are correct. And this red line shows that. And gee, there's a big difference there. We show taxes rising from a little over 5% to up over 40. And they do in the last decile, or not in the last, that's the last 400 households. Just 400 of them, it does in fact drop down a little, but it's still higher than any taxes anybody else pays except the people that are in the top 10%. So this inequity of taxes is a big argument between the rich guys, and the rest of us are not affected by it, because in fact, taxes go up as your income goes up. Now let's say what is it in the Zuckman stuff that is not right? Okay. There we go. First of all, the tax data in both series are essentially the same. They're within rounding error of each other. So we're using essentially the same amount of taxes. What's different is how much income do we divide it by, okay? And Sayers and Zuckman do not count any transfer payments. They only count earned income. So right there, they're removing 90% of the income in the bottom quintile, half of the income in the second quintile. So no wonder that it looks like they have a high tax rate. They're not counting all the income. But it's actually worse than that, because they also take the bottom 16% of earned income and just throw it away. And they only start, so the people that start out there at the bottom in the say Zuckman stuff over here are people that are in our data are actually up in the 16th percentile. So they just discarded them. Now think about it. If you make zero income and you're paying $1,000 in taxes, what's your tax rate? Infinite. Gee, we can't have that. Undefined. Or even if you're paying $1,000 and you have $5,000 of income, you're paying a 20% tax rate, you know? So what they solve their problem by just simply throwing it away. But if we count all the transfer payments, we get a rise that looks like that. So if you take from the 50th, decile up to the 90th decile, the two series are essentially the same. Just little variations there. But then all of a sudden we get another divergence. Well, this isn't from not counting transfer payments. This is from fictitious capital gains. Now, the red line includes realized capital gains, where you actually get money. But Sayers and Zuckman, as well as some other folks, said, well, that's not what we really want to count. We want to count all the income you get from your unrealized capital gains. You have a family farm. It goes up from being $1 million for 120 acres to $1.1 million for the 120 acres. That means you owe a tax on the $100,000 appreciation. Well, where am I going to get the money for that tax? Am I going to sell 16 acres off the edge of the farm? No, that's not going to work so well. And if everybody's doing that to pay their taxes, and of course, that's the whole wealth tax thing that I'm not going to get into in detail, but they count this fictitious income that nobody gets. You don't get any income from the appreciation of assets that you haven't yet cashed in on. And that's the whole difference. It's not counting the transfer payments at the bottom end and counting fictitious income at the top end. So that's where all this claim comes from. Now let's take a look at these international comparisons in one particular way. This is looking at the percent at the top 10% of income across multiple companies and countries in the OECD. And I'm going to use the United States as an example of just how it's calculated. In the United States, the top 10% of the population pays about 33.5% of its, gets about 33.5% of all the income. Okay, so the income share of the top 10% is they have, it's 10% of the population, 33% of the income. But they pay 45% of the taxes, okay? So that means that their share of the taxes is 34.6% greater than their share of the income. So that's a measure of the progressivity of the income, if you would. And in the United States, almost 35% more tax than you have income. Australia pays just a little, gets a little less than 30. Canada, you know, a little more than 20. And look at our socialist friends down there in France and Germany, they're running around 10%. So in the United States, this is for income and payroll taxes, the progressivity is much higher than in any of those other countries. So you certainly can't use other countries as a reason why we're not paying fair share. Okay. Now, finally, I want to look at this matter of the growth of prosperity across all income groups over the last 50 years. This bar chart is the distribution of income in 1967, but expressed in 2017 dollars. In other words, it's totally inflation adjusted. And on here, you can see the bottom quintile is everybody below roughly $15,000, and the second quintile runs up almost to $30,000. The top quintile begins at about $50,000 and goes up. So that's what it looked like 50 years ago. And you can see that we have the dashed lines going across there showing where each of the divisions is between each of the quintiles. So now let's see what 2017 looks like 50 years later. And let's just begin by looking where that bottom, the division between the top quintile and the fourth quintile in 1967 goes across to today. It is just barely into the second quintile. So that means all of the people in the bottom quintile and just a few of the people in the second quintile are at levels below what was the top 50 years ago. So that means that in 2017, 77% of households had income that would have placed them in the top quintile 50 years ago. You know, they not necessarily wouldn't have been at the, you know, the 1/10 of 1%. They're not the billionaires 50 years ago, but they are now at a very comfortable living level. At the other end, only 2% of the population that is in the bottom quintile today would have also been in the bottom quintile back in 1967. So this vast improvement in prosperity for almost the entire population. And that little 2% at the end is roughly the number we came out and what's the poverty rate. So there are a few people that are stuck, but there are a few people that are stuck. The prosperity has been broad and wide based. And I think that pretty much finishes off what I had to say, and we look forward to questions.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Yeah, Senator.
Let me add one thing on that last chart. People forget 50 years ago that half of the poverty housing in America did not have complete indoor plumbing. I go back to the town I grew up in, and I remember distinctly, we had a 1940 Plymouth. This was in the mid-50s. And when we would drive by Dr. Dykes' house, which was we thought was the nicest house in town, my mother would stick her finger out the window and say, if you work hard, you can have a house like it. And 50 years later, I drive by that house, and that house is a nice house, but it is basically an upper middle income house 50 years later. We forget how much richer America is. Almost nobody had air conditioning 50 years ago. We forget how much progress the country has made, and no 50 years in American history has been more maligned than the last 50 years. It's actually been a golden age in many, many ways. That's it.
Well said. Well said. Well, I'm going to ask a couple questions. We're going to have a quick conversation, but want to save a lot of time for audience questions. And so if you're watching on the live stream or you're here, get your questions ready because we'll be doing that in just a few moments. But to start off kind of on that point, Senator and John, you know, you talk about how the last 50 years have been maligned, and you showed the chart about if you add in transfer payments, that income inequality is actually much smaller than we've been led to believe. So would you say that the war on poverty you talk about has been successful? And also, what do you think we should be doing to create better outcomes based on these programs?
If the objective was to see that people didn't go hungry and were adequately housed and clothed. The current program has worked amazingly for all but about 2 or 3% of the population that's fallen through the cracks, mostly because of untreated mental illness and drug addiction. And those are the people, and there are millions of them. Remember that 2.5% of 330 million is a lot of people. Those are the people we see on the streets, and that these are people who aren't applying for the programs. But that wasn't the objective of the war on poverty. The objective of the war on poverty, as Lyndon Johnson said, was to make it possible for people to develop their own abilities and to become self-sustaining. By that definition, the war on poverty has been almost a complete failure, because half the people that were working when it started, and as a proportion of the population, no longer work. And look, if you can get as much for not working as you can get from working, we just can't be shocked that people don't work. The amazing thing to me is 36% of the people in the bottom quintile work. That's the surprising number, not the number that don't work. So the question is, how can we get the prosperity where people are developing their own abilities? And I guess I'm old-fashioned in that I believe happiness is knowing you've done something. And it belongs uniquely to those to you and to those who love you when you have actually achieved something yourself. And we're depriving millions, tens of millions of people of that opportunity in America. John, you want to add to that?
I think that did it. Well, kind of building off of that, also in your book, you talk about, and you mentioned in your presentations, that resentment that's been building in the middle class. How have you seen that play out, politically, and then also policy wise? What are some of the things we could do to make sure that our middle class is thriving again?
John, you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, let me start with the second half of that. What can we do to try to restore a reasonable relationship between effort and outcomes, if you would? And part of it gets back to assuring that the elementary and secondary education is sufficiently adequate that people can in fact thrive. And we've been absolutely abject failures at that point. That's where school choice is a strategy that has been shown to work. There may be yet other strategies that we can come up with, but we haven't seen them yet. So that's a key piece, so that everybody has the tools to succeed. And the second piece is that the incentives that government places in front of people are incentives that encourage them to work, not incentives that encourage them not to work, which is not only poor economics and poor public policy in many ways, but it's not good for the people in question. If your incentive is to remain idle on the sidelines of the work effort, then if you accept it, you're missing out on the opportunity for growth and for yet further prosperity, and government is therefore harming it. So that's that piece of it. I'm less up on the the political.
Yeah, I'm up on it. Well, we saw it with the Reagan Democrats, who in huge numbers voted for Ronald Reagan. And it was fully manifested in Trump's blue collar political base. I'm around a lot of blue collar people because I live out in the country. And I never heard a blue collar person talk about how they resent rich people. They resent people who sit on their butt, don't break a sweat, and live on the same street they live on. 45% of poor Americans own their own homes. Many of them own more than one car. And there's a lot of resentment about that. And it's not racism. It is a wrong that somebody, they work, their house, their wife works, their son may have a part-time job, and they're no better off than people that don't work. If they don't have much in the way of skills, they aren't better off. So I think that is a driving force in political realignment. And an article we have coming out in the Wall Street Journal next week talks about Hispanics. And what we show among Hispanics is the one thing Hispanics have in common is they work. They get 10% less public benefits than other groups. They're less represented in the bottom quintile. They're 21% overrepresented in the middle quintile. Middle income America is Hispanic America today. And they've always had Republican values. Now they have Republican economics. And so it's not surprising that they're changing their political alignment in massive numbers. And of course, we're going to get a test of that in South Texas. And also we pointed, the term Hispanic never made any sense. That's people that were in San Antonio before the Pilgrims came, and people came from Nicaragua yesterday. Hispanics more than 3 generations in the country don't identify themselves as Hispanic. 40% of Hispanics marry non-Hispanics. I mean, it was a political term that the census was forced by Congress to adopt. But if it ever had any distinction, it's pretty much gone now.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Well, I was telling John before the event that one of the things I was doing to prepare was reading pieces that were critical of the book. And there's some very interesting hit pieces out there on y'all. But one of the ones I thought was most interesting was a whole article that kind of delved into how you said that being Ebenezer Scrooge is not unethical. And so obviously I never want to be called a Scrooge, right? But we all kind of have this thought that, he's not very empathetic towards Bob Cratchit and others. But
it's interesting.
I would love for you to dive into that.
It's interesting they say that, but I don't say that. The author of the book says that he says describing Scrooge. And he says, he starts by saying, for Scrooge, business was the fair dealing of the world. And he talks about Scrooge working every day, going to this building that is so run down that only he lives there. Marley, his partner, dies and leaves his money to Scrooge, who keeps it invested. Okay. So the point that we make in the book is, and we talk about Scrooge and Warren Buffett, though we say Warren Buffett is much sweeter than Ebenezer Scrooge. But the point is, Scrooge wasn't cheating anybody. And the money he was investing, his nephew says, well, it's not doing him any good. He doesn't spend it. Well, who was it doing good? Well, that's the point we make. It was doing Great Britain good. It funded the Industrial Revolution that changed the world, changed our world. And we've never looked back. People forget, prior to the Industrial Revolution, there'd been no increase in wages for 1,000 years, except after the Black Death, where so many people died off. You had a labor shortage. And the point being that wealth accumulation and investment is a good thing. It produces rich people, but it produces a lot of prosperous people. And they're not the people who accumulated and live like Scrooge, but they get the benefit. That's the point. And no, I don't have any problem defending Scrooge. We need more Scrooge.
Very good. Well, if I get called one, I won't take offense next time. Well, so, Churchill was famous for saying that, capitalism is the worst economic system except for all others. And, when you look at some of the critics of this book and of capitalism in general, they talk about how the economic system has increased income inequality. You guys obviously spent countless pages disproving that. But, you know, I would love for you to talk a little bit about how housing costs and some of the government policies have led to the increase in affordable housing and the ability to buy homes, which, you know, when you go back to 1947, when you started your poverty, a house was much cheaper to afford than it is today. You know, we're seeing people move out of many cities that have six-figure salaries because they can't even afford to live there. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the policies that we're seeing in place that are causing a housing crisis in this country.
Well, let me respond and let John do most of responding, but I want to make this point. My mama bought a house for $9,700. She made $57 a week. And it had indoor plumbing and it had a floor furnace, one floor furnace. It didn't have a attic fan or it certainly didn't have any air conditioning. But housing is a lot cheaper today than it was when she bought this house in 1953. Because look at our income. I mean, who makes that kind of income that my mother made then? I think it's important to keep all this stuff in perspective. Now, housing costs are rising because interest rates are rising because we had a pandemic which reduced production, but also government spent in 3 years what it normally spends in 2. Well, there's only one thing can happen when that happens, that is prices go up. So now we've got higher interest rates, building costs are up. And I would say that it's all as a result of bad government.
You know, I can add some more to that list of bad government. I mean, the senator there.
We don't have a whole lot of time left, so
Yeah, I'll try to keep it under 90 minutes. But Senator listed some of the more current things, but more structurally. Now in Texas, it's less of a problem than some other places, but zoning drives costs up. Building codes, regulations of one kind or another. Rent control drives housing costs up because it makes housing more scarce because people won't buy it. Public housing drives housing costs up because what do we do? We give it to a developer who goes develops it. They then that then pulls housing resources out of the marketplace and it's now under the control of the government and it's given away rather than earned away. And those structural things, and I'll keep my 90 seconds here, add to it and have been adding to it for the last 50 years. So that makes it higher. Although some of the highness we see is not because housing costs per se are higher, it's because the quality of the housing is so much bigger. The housing in the market today is about twice the size per person in the house as it was 50 years ago. So you're buying more house. It's because we're more prosperous. So you got to be careful what you're comparing, but absolutely housing prices, especially in some particular cities and states, are out of control because government has intervened and interrupted the market process.
Great, thank you. Well, this last question before we go to audience questions, so please get those ready. So I'd like you guys to tell me a little bit about why you think that the American dream is alive and well, and how we can extend that to the next generation.
Well, we make the point in the mobility chapter that the statistics show that 93% of people that grew up in the poorest households do better than their parents, and that income mobility is extraordinarily strong. But I think the best way to see what has happened in America is to look at your own family. And to look at the progress that's been made. And when we're measuring mobility, we're measuring it in one generation. Okay, 6.1% of people that grow up in poor households become rich. Pretty amazing number. But that's one generation. George Washington's mother came to this country as an indentured worker. George Washington became probably the richest man in colonial America and according to King George III, the greatest man in the world. Okay, it was 3 generations. Normally, people don't just make it in 1 generation. Obviously, there are people who do, but Bill Gates was born in the top quintile. So was Musk. But they made tremendous progress from there. I don't know where their parents came from, but look, success in America is so routine, we just take it for granted. This idea that the American dream is dried up, if you dropped out of the labor market to take welfare, the answer is that it has dried up. And I don't blame people for that. If you provide incentives, you got to expect people to respond to the incentives. It's our fault and we need to change it. But progress is everywhere. As I say at the concluding of the book, John and I debated about this, so I said it. It's better to be born rich and beautiful and brilliant. But you can be none of those things and succeed in America. And people do it every single day, every single day.
I feel seen based on that. Yeah, that's right.
Johnny, if you get a choice, take the rich, beautiful, and brilliant, but don't give up because you're not those things.
That's right. That's right. John, anything you'd like to add to that? Okay. All right. Very good. We'll end on that. All right. So now we want to go to audience questions. Clint over here has the microphone, so please wait on him and please remember to
talk into the microphone because people have yelled at me, including my wife, and so I don't hear too good.
And make sure it's a question is most important. Yes, sir. Right here.
I really enjoyed the presentation. A few years ago, I used to do a lot of analysis on the OECD data. And I don't remember the formulation at the time, but I remember reading and coming across a lot of research that claimed that the vertical economic mobility in the United States about, I guess, 15 years ago, fell below that of Europe for the first time in the history of American history. Is any of this sounding familiar to you? And one of the hypothesized reasons for that was because of the spike in the price of higher education. So, that was one of the reasons, the causal reasons behind this trend. Is any of this echoing sort of familiarity?
Well, yeah, OECD data has lots, and we use it, but we use it with care. And in fact, in part of the book, we actually debunk some of their data because it is incomplete, and sometimes at the fault of our own Census Bureau, because when our Census Bureau reports it, they don't report the whole picture. On income inequality, that was particularly true. So my suspicion is that result actually shows reflects that some of that reporting issue. OECD about 8 or 9 years ago did a good study on the taxes. It's not the tax study I showed you, but it was a similar study that really nailed down just how much more progressive the U.S. taxes were. They have not repeated that study because and I'm just suspicious, but there are some issues there. And saying that the U.S. we know that the U.S. mobility has not fallen. The data don't show that at all. If you're looking at U.S. data by itself, but I have not seen the specific OECD study you mentioned, but I know the underlying data are missing transfer payments and other things.
What does the study show?
He's saying that mobility in the United States has fallen, and relative also to Europe, and part of it is the cost of higher education. But part of what I would also say is on the higher education part is, well, if the cost has fallen so much, but the people are still going to higher education more so than in any other country in Europe. The number of college educated people in the U.S. is much higher than in Europe. So that couldn't possibly be the cause of it.
Very good. Well, I know we've gone over a little bit, so we have time for 2 more questions. So we have one right here.
Hello, Douglas Gibbons. From good data come good decisions by rational people, reasonable folks, and you've done a good job here illuminating some of that. There's the disconnect between the census and all the other departments in the federal government. How do we coalesce or bring these together so that our decision makers are making choices based upon the same set of facts, accurate facts?
Well, one of the things we recommend in the book in the last chapter is a proposal for Congress to make the census count all income and taxes in its income measures. It's amazing that this has happened. I mean, the hardest part of selling the ideas of the book is just hard to believe. It's just hard to believe. Now, the census is basically, I do think it's interesting that the critics of the book have never challenged anything we concluded. It's just, what could possibly be wrong with somebody who could find something good to say about Ebenezer Scrooge? Well, hell, if that's all you got to say, it's not much. But the point is that we need to, the Bible says you shall know the truth and the truth will make you free, but you got to ferret out the truth. And so the first recommendation we make is that Congress mandate that we collect data counting all income and all taxes, and that be the official data. Now, the census is going to say two things eventually, because they're not going to be able to sit out this debate. They're going to say, well, look, we never claimed that this was anything other than what our data is. Well, they sure as hell kept it to themselves. And also, they put out these numbers on income inequality and doesn't take into account taxes. I mean, how can you justify that? The second argument is well, maybe some of these benefits aren't worth what they cost. That's not an unimportant argument. Now, some of them, Medicaid, it costs the government about 70% of what it would cost you to buy the same health care. So it's a hard argument to make there, but they're all legitimate debating points. And we're not trying to end a debate here. We're trying to start a debate.
Great. Thank you. All right, time for one last question. Friend Dale, right up here.
Thank you both. Appreciate it. And as a proud Phil Gramm acolyte from back in the day, I want to mention something that I did in 1974 in my high school debate team on the 10th anniversary of the Great Society. My introductory comment was, we have built ourselves a welfare state that draws the disadvantaged into dependency, and in so doing exacerbates social tension in this nation. And I've remembered this all as the decades go on, and it continues to exacerbate social tension. So my question for you guys is, how do we amplify what you are saying? Because that's in the book. How do we get that through a loud megaphone, through a broad audience as possible?
It starts by reading the book. Don't be
book too, right?
Don't be put off by Early's graphs and charts, okay? Because when you're telling people something is so, that they read the government saying it's not so, and vice versa, you got to give the numbers. But there's nothing in the book other than adding and subtracting. So don't be put off by it. Read the book and talk to people about it. Ideas are powerful things. They can change the world. And I think if we just can make the government straighten the numbers out, once the American people know the facts, they'll know what to do. The truth is that Bernie Sanders went to bed and dreamed that America would become a welfare state. And he woke up and he's going to see our numbers and say, my dream came true. Now, it's still not a country he's happy with. And I'm unhappy with it only in the sense that it could be so much better. Ronald Reagan used to like to say, imagine what we could really have if we had good government. We changed a few things and the country was dramatically transformed. But Reagan would always say, imagine if we really could change things for the better. And that's the point. America is the greatest country in the history of the world, but it could be so much greater. There's so many talented people out there that never get discovered. I think that's the message of the book. But again, please take time to read it. Yeah, okay.
We heard you. We heard you. Take time to read it and take time to buy it.
Well, I wish there were some magic way to get people to go to start debating and talking the issues, because that's what's critical. Let's get down to the facts and decide what to do based on the facts. And we've been looking only at a fraction of the facts up to this point in time. And until we get that discussion, then it's harder. Now, there are some people that are becoming interested in it, but you know, it's not the noisiest or the sexiest issue out there, but it has profound implications, and we need to try to raise it. Events like this,
We're doing these all over the country.
yeah, and even doing them in my hometown. So, you know, we're going to do them where we can, and you know, do it in your hometown. Invite us out. We'll come talk. You know, run the videos. Write letters to the editor. As my wife was explaining to the Senate here at one point, that she put a stop to my writing letters to the editor because I was making so many inflammatory statements. But nevertheless, go for it. You know, and if we don't debate it, if we don't talk about it, it just, you know, sits there. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, I think that's a great way to close. Thank you all so much for joining us online and for being here in person. Those of you in person, you can read the book because we have books for you outside. And Senator,
I've already signed them also.
yeah, has already signed them for you. And so, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Clint. Oh, we have more work for you to do, sir. Well, he'll be signing books for you outside, him and John. So please get a book. It's free of charge. It's our gift to you. And then, you know, Senator Gramm, John, thank you so much for writing this book and having this discussion. I think it's so important. So please help me thank Senator and John for doing this. All right. Thank you all. Appreciate it.